At JSM Pros, we love to hear about your projects and challenges. For example, a subscriber sent us a radio button challenge. Specifically, can a label contain several hundred characters? Now, PeopleSoft is a metadata-driven application, so it may appear as though we are limited or constrained by metadata definitions. I mean, it stands to reason that the length of a label must fit within a defined field. So, what are the metadata constraints for a radio button label? First, let's describe a radio button. A radio button series is a mutually exclusive list of options. In fact, you might think of a radio button series as an alternative way to render a drop-down list of values. A radio button, therefore, is just one of the buttons in the series. Here's what a radio button series looks like in PeopleSoft. When creating a radio button series, we add the same field to the page multiple times, as I've done here. I drug my derived work field onto the page multiple times, selecting a different translate value for each button. The labels come from the translate values, and the label must be 30 characters or less, as we see here from PS_XLAT item. XLAT long name, 30 characters. Okay, so metadata limitation number 1, we're confined to 30 characters. What about overriding the label on the page? So, in fact, that's what I've done here. As you'll note, going to label and then text, you can see that I overrode the text. If we look at the metadata table for that, PS panel field, we see label text has a maximum line length limitation of 60 characters. So metadata limitation number 2 is 60 characters. Now, if we just use metadata, our maximum label length is 60 characters. But do we have to use metadata? I mean, is there a workaround? Actually, I have a fantastic solution, super simple, but I'm going to save it to the very end. Let's keep investigating because I want you to understand the options and why we chose the solution. I'll share at the end. Before we code a solution or a workaround, let's look at the browser. Are there any browser-based limitations? So let's inspect and let's see what kind of HTML PeopleSoft generates for a radio button. We can see there's a div element with the radio button control and then an actual HTML label. And I'm not aware of any limitations with HTML labels. While we're here in the inspector, let's talk about some client-side options. First, we could use the CSS after pseudo selector to extend the text. Second, we could use JavaScript to replace the text. Now, keep in mind, this isn't how I would solve this issue, but it's a fantastic way to demonstrate custom JavaScript and CSS. So let's do this. The text that we want here, it says, I do not have steel-toe boots. But that's actually just an abbreviated version of what we really want. I do not have steel-toed boots, do not intend to acquire them, and understand the risks of not having adequate personal protective equipment. That's what we want. Now, there's several different ways we can solve this. I'm going to show you at the end my favorite way, a way that I think is super easy, maybe perhaps not intuitive, not the first way we'd think of. In fact, the first way I would think of to solve this is to attempt the translate value. Well, we saw that wouldn't work. This is too long. Second way, override the text on the page. Well, this is too long for that as well. Okay, what's the third way? Ask your users to shorten the text. Just tell them we have a 60 character maximum limitation and see how far you get with that. Now, sometimes that's not the right answer. Sometimes perhaps there's regulatory requirements. Perhaps there's actual legal language we have to use here for this radio button. We see from the HTML, there is no limitation. It appears to be a metadata limitation. Let's see what we can do to work around that metadata limitation. Okay, let's start with CSS. If we were to use CSS, I would want a CSS selector. We could then use the after with content to identify what's the text we want to add to the text we already have. So to create a selector, a very specific selector, I would use the ID selector. And I can see here the ID $3 in the middle there. I don't like that. Now, there is a way in Application Designer that you and I can specify the selector. We can hard code it. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to go to the General tab of the field properties and enter in a page field name. That'll pass through the HTML to become the ID for the element. So I'm going to use a site-specific prefix here, JSM, and keep it generic. How about option? This is the second option in the list of radio buttons. How about option 2? So JSM option 2, I like it. Let's save, let's reload, and let's see what that did to the ID. JSM option to LBL. Perfect. Okay, so now using let's go ahead and mock up some CSS here. Okay, so I'm going to add a style rule. JSM option to LBL. Perfect. And then we want to use the after pseudo selector. After. And then let's give it some text. So content. And we'll just use empty text for now. And then we'll grab the text that comes after. Paste that in here. That's fantastic. I love it. That's beautiful, don't you think? Okay, how would I persist that? So fortunately, the browser has saved. It started mocking up what's my style sheet going to look like. I'll copy that. And here in Application Designer, I'll create a new style sheet. It's going to be a freeform sub style sheet. I'll paste in my CSS. Actually, you know what? We can do better. There's a nice little formatting button we can click here. For some reason, the browser, it one-lined it minified, which is fantastic from a transfer and transport perspective, but not so much for debugging. So let's go ahead and format that. So let's grab the formatted CSS, paste that in here. Perfect. So much easier to read. I like it. Let's save it. Let's give it a name. How about JSM? How about PPEFF? FF for freeform. And then we just need to associate that with our page. We do that through PeopleCode. And the add style sheet function. Save, reload, and you can see that it did in fact persist the actual text we want at the end. Now, here's what I love about this solution. We extended the label. I see here the after text. It's all part of the label element. So if a screen reader were to read, it would read everything in the label. Or would it? That's actually a good question. And that's something that you and I, as we're developing solutions, that's something we have to think about. I mean, it appears to be part of the label. You can see it's a child of the label, but it's for display purposes. It's CSS. CSS is all about display. So some screen readers and assistive technology will ignore the CSS. It didn't actually append to. In fact, if you were to try and copy, you'll notice that it doesn't copy the text there. This is not actually part of the actual textual content, which is why I say assistive technology may actually ignore it. So the accessibility guidelines discourage the use of the CSS after pseudo selector for this text. Now, if you are able to read the text on the screen visually, it's perfect. But we can't eliminate our assistive users, those that are using assistive technology. So what's another alternative? I mean, this is great. I kind of like it, but you can see it has problems. So that's maybe not the optimal solution. It's a solution, not optimal. So what if we were to take the same idea, but rather than using CSS, how about we use JavaScript? So we'll use our selector. So document dot query selector. And then here's our selector here, the JSM options to LBL. That's going to select the item for us. Option 2. There, that's better. I can see at the bottom there, it was telling me what it's going to select, and it said null. Told me I had done something wrong. Okay, great. Now we want to replace the text on the inside. Enter text. And we'll grab that from our clipboard. Move it to our clipboard. And I did something wrong. Oh, yes, sorry. Enter text is a property, not a method. Perfect. Okay, now here's what I like about this. It's all part of the label text. It's selectable. It's real text there, which means assistive technology would identify it, recognize it, and use it properly. So how would we persist this? How would we move this into PeopleSoft so every time we reload the page, this JavaScript appears? Since this is fluid, we can use add-on load script with our JavaScript fragment. And then as the page loads, it's going to apply the content. Now, this is fantastic, but it has its own problem. See, what's great with assistive technology, it it appears to be great all the way around until you embed it in an activity guide or a master detail component. See, here's what I found with activity guides or master detail or anything that loads content into what we call a grouplet in PeopleSoft. The add on load script, which means run this JavaScript after load, that event triggers before the content actually loads. So it never really runs that JavaScript. So is there a simple PeopleCode solution for this? Let's see if we can find one. So what if we just go back to PeopleCode and set the label, .label. Let's do this. Do you see that type ahead show up when I hit the dot? You didn't see that? Neither did I. So have you noticed it though? Sometimes it works in App Designer and sometimes it doesn't show. Let me show you how you can make that drop-down type ahead show up every time. It's based off of variables. So if we declare a variable of a particular type, then the compiler knows the variable type and can show us the type ahead. Okay, now nf dot. We have a semicolon in the middle here. Okay, that's better. F dot label equals, and let's grab our text again, move it onto our clipboard. Okay, you ready? Let's hit refresh. And of course, it changes all of the labels to match because the same field is on the page multiple times. And so what we're doing is referencing every instance of that field. Is there another way? The answer is yes. Instead of using getField, we can use getPageField. GetPageField references one instance of, and it references it by name. So it asks you what field do you want and on what page. So we'll go with %page because we're using page activate. So it's going to be the current page, what page, and what field. It's called JSM option 2. Why is it named that? Because that's what I named it here on the general tab. And now we're getting one instance of, so we can set the label. That's fantastic. This is the solution that I would use. I would use getPageField with a named field to set the label of a particular page field. And since we're not using metadata, we don't have the same line length limitation. Okay, now there's one thing I would do differently before moving this into production. Our code, our string, our label, it's hard-coded here in text. So we should probably use the message catalog with the explain message to get the content, which can be as long as we want it to be because there's no line length limitation on the explain message in the message catalog. Now, I have a question for you though. One more question. One more thing that I might change. I'm not sure though. You see, in this example, I wrote the PeopleCode in the page activate event because, well, it was easiest. I could just right-click and choose View Page PeopleCode. But is that the correct event? What do you think? Let me know by leaving your idea as a comment. And be sure to let us know why you chose the event you chose. I mean, page activate triggers every time we swap tabs within a component. Does this code need to trigger every time? Let us know what you think. At JSM Pros, we teach PeopleTools concepts like this every week. Be sure to check out our website to see what we're offering next. Or here's an idea. Subscribe to our LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter feeds to receive updates every time we post a course. Or do you have a team that wants to learn more? Give us a call and let's get something scheduled. Now, before we go, I have another question for you. Do you have a topic you'd like us to cover in a future soundbite? Let us know by sharing your ideas at soundbites.jsmpros.com. Now, if you enjoyed this episode, be Be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe for more content. And we look forward to seeing you in the next episode.